Hello, media friends, general public, everyone watching this webcast today. Thank you wherever you're tuning in from. Very happy to have you here for the presentation of the OECD G20 base erosion and profit shifting project's final outcomes. Today the reports, the entire project will be presented by Pascal Saint-Amans, the director of the Center for Tax Policy Administration here at the OECD. Pascal will walk you through the BEPS package, and then we'll take questions from everyone on the webcast. As you know, those of you who've watched these webcasts before, you're able to type in your questions directly into the screen. You should see that in front of you. Look forward to getting those, and I'm going to turn the floor over now to Pascal.
Thanks, Larry. Good morning, afternoon, evening, maybe night to all of you who are watching this webcast. Very happy and almost relieved to be able to finally present you the outcome of our work for the past 2 years and a half. We're happy that we completed the work, almost completed. There are just a couple of leftovers, but which are really insignificant compared to the magnitude of the task, and happy to brief you on where we are. Maybe to start with some element of process. The BEPS package has finally been approved by the OECD and G20 member countries at the technical level. There is a political agreement which has translated with technical agreement to the package that I will present to you in a few minutes. What you need to have in mind is that this process now goes to the political circles, meaning the OECD Council, which had a look at it last week on the 1st of October, and now it's moving to the G20 finance ministers who are going to meet in Lima, in Peru, on the 8th of October, and they will have a dinner dedicated to international tax matters, where the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, will present this holistic package. And then, further on, if endorsed by the G20 finance ministers, this will go to the G20 leaders when they meet in Antalya in Turkey mid-November. What is this about? You know the background. The background is that we started in 2012 this work to fight base erosion and profit shifting at the request of the G20. We did a report explaining that there was an issue. We were not able to quantify it at that time, but we said there was an issue and that there was a need for a holistic response. Here is the holistic response. The overall BEPS package, which is made of 13 reports, as you can see from the screen, together with an explanatory statement. Why 13 reports when we had 15 actions? Because on transfer pricing, we actually had 3 actions, but they have been consolidated into one report because mostly it translates into changes to the transfer pricing guidelines, the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, and this has been consolidated, but we have actually addressed the 3 types of issues which were identified in the BEPS action plan. In addition to the 13 reports, as you can see, we have what we have called an explanatory statement. The explanatory statement is the common understanding by all the countries which have participated to that work on what it means. What's the level of commitment, what's their engagement here, and what is going to happen next. This document is extremely important. First, because it's only 14 pages long and it's not too technical. So for those of you who are not lucky enough to be tax specialists, please have a look at it. It's been drafted for you. But it's also a political commitment by all the countries. All the countries meaning all the OECD member countries, 34 of them, all the G20 non-OECD member countries, 8 of them, Colombia and Latvia, which are joining the OECD accession countries, but also more than 15 developing countries which have joined the work, and you will have the list of these countries in the annex of the explanatory statement, which I strongly recommend you have a look at. Now, if we get into the details, and I will try to be short so that we have time for Q&As. If we look at the details, we do have agreement. So the first key message is that we have agreement from all these countries on a comprehensive package. All the measures being consensual, nobody objected to them, meaning that all these measures now are agreed by all the member countries. That's one. Second, we have very strong agreement. You know, it's easy to reach an agreement when you empty the content. This is not the case here. The reason why we have a strong agreement is because we had strong political support. And the techies, the tax specialists who did negotiate that, actually had a mandate to really fix the system. The 15 measures will translate into different levels of commitments. We do have minimum standards. That's not a standard a minima, the least common denominator, or a standard where countries could do more or less. Not the case. The minimum standards are really things that all the countries have committed to implementing fast, no more, no less. It's the case with the rest of the package, except that for these, if one country does not implement, we would have risks of spillovers, and that's why we have the minimum standards. The other measures are standards. The other measures are commitment by the countries, by all the countries around the table, to implement. Some of them are best practices, meaning that the countries can implement if they want to, because there is no spillovers. If you want to protect your tax base, you can do it. If you don't want to do it, you're not obliged, but the others will have the instruments to do so. And finally, above these, we do have what we've called common approaches, meaning that countries feel like we must move into that direction, they will coordinate, they will converge over time, they will check in a few years' time where we are on this, and you have a strong convergence. Now, if we go through the different actions very quickly. Action 2 is about the hybrid mismatches. You will remember that this was already agreed last year, this has been consolidated, and we have provided model domestic legislations for the countries willing to put an end to hybrid mismatches. We know that a number of countries have already started implementing. They have anti-hybrid mismatches legislation passed, and this is completed by some provisions for tax treaties. So hybrid mismatches should come to an end. And you know what? Here, countries are not obliged to move, but if a partner of yours hasn't moved, you can protect yourself because that's the way it has been embedded in the model tax legislation. CFC legislations, control foreign companies. This is the type of action which protects you from the delocalization of your tax base in zero or low tax jurisdiction. We have best practices which are compatible with the EU legislation, and here again, many countries are willing to draw on this best practice. Action 4 was pretty critical. It's about interest deductibility. What we have come up with is a recommendation, a strong recommendation to all the countries to limit interest deductibility to an EBITDA ratio. And we have a corridor here. So countries should converge to limit interest deductibility to 10 to 30% of the EBITDA. Very strong message here. It may not be yet a minimum standard, but countries are converging. Harmful tax practices. We had already an agreement last year on patent boxes. We don't necessarily like much patent boxes in terms of tax policy. But for sure, patent boxes can be extremely harmful if they are given to intellectual property which has not been developed locally on site. So we have developed what we have called a nexus approach to limit the toxicity of patent boxes. Similarly, on rulings, we have come up with the rules that we will have automatic exchange of tax rulings, and we're very glad to understand that tomorrow the European Commission is likely to get an agreement from the ECOFIN on automatic exchange of tax rulings, which is the implementation of the agreement which was reached at the global level, so that this will foster the implementation of the automatic exchange of information of tax rulings. Then we move to the second pillar of the measures, which are about tax treaties, and here a minimum standard on fighting treaty shopping. All the countries will implement in their tax treaties, will include in their tax treaties these provisions to put an end to treaty shopping. You know treaty shopping, to invest from country A to country B, you go through country C because you can locate the profit all there which will be untaxed. This is coming to an end. Action 7 was about the definition of the permanent establishment. You may have heard about commissionaire arrangements, which were facilitated by the way Article 5 of the Modal Tax Convention was designed. We're fixing this. These schemes will be over thanks to this new drafting, and will also include in the new Article 5 some provisions to make sure that if you have storage and delivery in one country, you can see that there are some new schemes, in particular due to the digitalization of the economy, which correspond to that. This will no longer provide an exemption. In other words, you will be a taxable person in the country where you have the storage and the delivery. Then we can move to transfer pricing. 3 major actions to change the standard here. We do have, and we've had, transfer pricing guidelines for the past 50 years or more than that, because the arm's length principle dates back originally to 1928 and the League of Nations. The transfer pricing guidelines were actually pretty weak in the sense that they allowed artificial schemes or just massive schemes where you could shift the profits through an artificial shift of the risks or the capital or whatsoever in zero or low tax jurisdictions. This is also coming to an end. You will hear, and maybe we'll have Q&As on that, many people saying, oh, if you don't do formulary apportionment or unitary taxation, which means you calculate the profit at global level and then you share among countries, nothing will be fixed. Well, if it were to be the case, I mean, better to get rid of corporate income tax because there is no agreement to move there. So we had to repair the existing system. And that's what we have done. It may sound extremely technical, but I can tell you that all the schemes using cash boxes where you put all the intellectual property, you put a lot of capital, you just have the legal arrangement making sure that this letterbox will have the ownership of the intellectual property, that's coming to an end. This is over with the new transfer pricing rules, which, by the way, are immediately implementable as they are the authorized interpretation of the existing Article 9 of tax treaties. Then we have a number of measures dealing with transparency. First, we have measured the phenomenon. 3 years ago, I remember a number of observers saying, well, you're talking about BEPS, but please quantify. And we could not quantify, so we had to work for 2 years to do some form of quantification, some form of estimate. What we have come up with is extremely conservative. But even though taking very conservative hypotheses, assumptions, we have come up with a figure which is between $100 billion to $240 billion a year, which would be evaporated through base erosion and profit shifting. This is pretty significant and broadly in line with the IMF or UNCTAD estimates, recognizing that developing countries are even more hit than developed countries in relative terms in CIT on GDP. Then we have a best practice for the countries interested in asking for the disclosure of schemes, and many countries have tried unsuccessfully to pass such legislations. We are now confident that they will be able to move ahead drawing on this best practice. And we have come up, and the agreement was already reached last year, we just have the mechanism now in place, the country-by-country reporting. You all know about it. It's very significant. This will have a major behavioral impact on taxpayers. There are 3 horizontal actions. One is on the digital economy. Action 1, because we all feel like the digitalization of the economy is going to have an impact on the structures of tax systems. And the report is extremely complex and interesting and actionable. One, it says that no ring-fence solution is appropriate because it's the digital economy is the economy itself. Second layer, we recognize that the digitalization of the economy increases the BEPS risks, and therefore the BEPS measures will be extremely important, but will have to be monitored. Are we reaching the goal of eliminating double non-taxation? Finally, we have taken very precise and concrete actions on VAT, clarifying the rules of VAT on e-services. Where am I taxable on VAT where I download an application from one country on my cell phone when I'm on another country than mine, or where I'm in my own member country? So what's the rule? We will be clarifying for all the countries, and this is aligned with what the EU is doing, but beyond that, we'll put in place the mechanisms, the exchange of information mechanism, to make sure that we can enforce this agreement. Also, we've revised, as I indicated, the definition of Article 5 of the Tax Convention, which means the permanent establishment definition. Finally, we've said we don't know all the consequences, and we need to monitor that. So there will be a monitoring, and we have a few options which have been provided for countries. There is no consensus on these options, but they will have to look into these, especially in the light of the monitoring of the work which will be done in this area. The second horizontal action is about improving the way tax administrations deal with the cases of double taxation. We certainly don't want to move from double non-taxation to double taxation. And we have all recognized, all the member countries participating to that work, that they are not very good at eliminating double taxation where such a case occurs. And that's why they have agreed a minimum standard on the elimination of double taxation where there are disputes between tax authorities. That's transparency from the tax administrations to the taxpayers, which was absolutely necessary. Last and not least, Action 15. Action 15 is about saying, well, we will be recommending changes to the Modal Tax Convention. This is soft legislation. And then it takes 2 decades to change the actual 3,600 bilateral treaties. To avoid that, we said, as you all agree on these changes, why don't you put them in a multilateral instrument, which is hard law, and which will change automatically all the existing bilateral treaties among the parties to the multilateral instrument. And we've already started the implementation to the extent that an ad hoc group has been set up. We have now more than 90 countries, 90 in this group, and this group has started negotiating the multilateral instrument, which shows that we've already moved into the implementation phase. Because, and I will close with that, we are at a juncture today. We are going to get this package approved by the G20, but we need now to start the implementation. There are a few challenges. One is implementation. Implementation is about translating all these measures into legislation, into actual practices by tax administration. This is extremely important. Second, we need to ensure a monitoring on the minimum standards in particular, to make sure that we level the playing field, that all the countries are committed and implement their commitments in line with the different deadlines which have been fixed there. But we also need to monitor what's going on, to understand, to have the intelligence of the dynamic of corporate income tax, of the dynamic of tax planning from companies, of the dynamic of tax administrations, to make sure that they stick to the agreement and that they don't turn rogue asking for whatever. The third key feature of this BEPS implementation phase is about inclusiveness. We have largely consulted developing countries. They've been involved. Nothing in the BEPS action plan, contrary to what you can see in some propaganda, which is not fair. Nothing is against the interest of developing countries. We fully recognize that many of the BEPS actions may not be the priority of developing countries, or that some of the priorities of developing countries may not be covered. And that's why with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the UN, we are going to work. We have already started working, and you may have seen a joint IMF-OECD report on tax incentives, which has been published. So we are going to be inclusive in the framework for an inclusive implementation of BEPS that the G20 mandated us to develop, and that we will be putting in place by early 2016, and we'll be reporting on this to the G20 finance ministers in Shanghai in February, as China is taking over the G20 presidency in December. These are the challenges ahead of us: implementation, monitoring, inclusiveness. But today, I think it's time to acknowledge that we've done this, and this is a change of paradigm. We're moving from an environment where it was very easy to obtain double non-taxation by the use of the existing instruments, by the fact that many instruments to bridge the gaps between sovereignty were not available. We're changing the paradigm. Now the instruments are in the hands of tax administrations to make sure that we don't have double non-taxation and that we don't have double taxation either. Thank you.
Well, Pascal, thank you very much for running us through the different elements of the BEPS package. We have quite a number of questions here, so I think we'll just dive right into them. Given the format that we have, I'm going to read the questions to you, and then we'll let you answer them. We'll go one at a time, yeah? I think a good one to start with, and something that follows well on your presentation, is how are we going to measure the success of the BEPS project? Looking forward as we go into what we've been talking about as the environment after the BEPS presentation, how do we measure what happens next, and how do we declare that the work is going forward?
Thank you, Larry. That's the good question, I would say. How do you measure the success? Is the success about, 240 billions coming into the coffers of the governments, or is it something else? Clearly, that's not the case. There are many factors, and we may end up with some countries deciding to reduce the corporate income tax rates because of the broadening of the tax base, which I think would be great news for the local companies. The local companies which cannot benefit from the loopholes in the international tax system. Broadening the base, reducing the rate may be something positive. A number of countries, therefore, may do that, like the US in the very much expected international tax reform, which I think is a very good illustration of this trend towards reducing the rates. But also, some money will come in. The way I would assess the success of the BEPS project is about changing behavior, the behavioral impact of what has been done, in terms of turning tax planning into a support function in companies instead of a profit center. We've seen for the past 2 decades tax planning becoming something absolutely key to the way companies function, and this is wrong. Tax is a support function. Companies need to pay the taxes to the governments where they operate, and this is the instrument. What we are delivering are the instruments which will allow the tax administrations to make sure that the tax which are due are effectively paid, and because most of the schemes were legal, that some of the schemes, these schemes, turn illegal, meaning that they will stop because the people will understand that when you have all your profits in one jurisdiction where there is no activity in that jurisdiction, this is just the wrong response. So we've realigned the location of the profits with the location of the activities. And that's what we are going to measure through Action 11. There is a follow-up, and the success of BEPS will be measured through the follow-up on this action.
Thanks very much, Pascal. We've got quite a number of questions coming in. One that I think is quite interesting. You alluded earlier in the presentation to the different types of deliverables. One of the types of deliverables are minimum standards. Some of the outcomes are minimum standards. Many of the others aren't. Can you give us a little more explanation of why that's the case, and whether there's a consensus around this?
Thank you, Larry. Actually, there is consensus on the overall package. It's the overall package which has been agreed as reflected in the explanatory statement. And this is big. I know there are many people skeptical saying, well, you haven't reached any agreement because all the actions do not have the same level, and you have some others saying, well, there are too many options. So we have criticisms from everywhere here, or actually from some extreme ends there, I should say. What we have agreement upon is the overall package. All the countries have agreed that they can, that they should, in some cases they must protect their tax bases, and therefore they're entitled to take these measures. Some of the measures, again, will not be imposed on anyone. If a country doesn't want to do that, so be it. But the partners will be able to do this. And this is something which has happened in a coordinated manner. But much beyond these best practices, we have the usual standards. There is agreement in the new Modal Tax Convention. There is agreement in the transfer pricing guidelines. And in some cases, it goes even further. So that's a very strong message which is sent when we have so-called minimum standard. This is not a new legal category. This is just a new signal, political signal, that the countries want to go beyond the usual agreement. Even though at the OECD we do not have harmonization, and we don't want to have harmonization rules, what is happening here is all the countries saying we need to be serious. They have a good precedent. Exchange of information. You will remember that it's based on the Modal Tax Convention, Article 26, and all the countries have agreed this, but they decided to go beyond and say we all must implement this, and we'll monitor the way that we implement. This is what is happening on the minimum standards there. Harmful tax practices, All the countries have committed to exchange automatically their tax rulings. Patent boxes, they have all agreed to fix their patent boxes so that they would comply with what we have called the nexus approach. You need to have a nexus between the activities generating the income which will benefit the patent box and the patent box itself. That's one minimum standard. Treaty shopping. All the countries must incorporate in their bilateral treaties the anti-abuse provision. There is an option there. You can do limitation of benefit, you can do main purpose test, but they all change their existing treaties where needed. Some treaties, of course, like the US network, are fully compatible with this minimum standard, but all the others will have to change when they are not compatible. Then the country-by-country reporting. All the countries have agreed that we must implement country-by-country reporting as soon as possible, and it is expected that the fiscal year 2016 will have to be reported on a country-by-country basis by multinationals, the largest multinationals. Those, the turnover of is above 750 billion. You would say it's only 10% of the multinationals. And I would respond, but that's 90% of the turnover and of the profit. So that's very significant. And of course, we revise all these by 2020 to broaden as necessary. Finally, on the elimination of double taxation, there is a minimum standard on the mutual agreement procedure. So you can see that it's a holistic package which has been agreed, even though given the nature of the different measures, the level of commitment may not be the same to the extent that in some all the countries will move, in some others all the countries have agreed, transfer pricing, guidelines, model tax convention. In some, all the countries have recognized that those interested in protecting their tax base can do on the basis of what has been agreed.
Thanks, Pascal. You were just talking about implementation, and I think it's a good follow-up question. What happens in the instance when a country, a given country or several, for instance, don't implement? What happens to the outcomes as a whole?
The way the BEPS package has been conceived is about complexity and to make sure that all these measures complement each other. In other words, we didn't want to be trapped in the case where if one country does not implement one of the 15 actions, the overall architecture collapses. Because that's more or less one of the difficulties we faced back in the 90s when we started the work on so-called harmful tax competition. It proved extremely difficult. And that's why here you have measures which complement each other. If one country doesn't move here, the other countries will be able to protect themselves there. Good example, hybrid mismatches. If not all the countries implement, doesn't matter, because those interested in protecting themselves will do so, and they will not be put at a competitive disadvantage. Where there was a risk of unleveling the playing field, then we have the minimum standards. So you can see that all these measures complement each other. For instance, country-by-country reporting will go together with the changes on transfer pricing and maybe on tax treaties as well. The end of the cash boxes, this end will be provided by both the changes on transfer pricing, but also on CFC legislation, so the countries which will implement CFC legislation, but also on interest deductibility. So you see that there is a convergence, because we're not naive. We know that most of these schemes are pretty robust, or that not all the countries will move at the same time. And that's why we had to do this pretty complex, but quite flexible package. And we are confident that if countries implement, this will have an impact. Now, of course, the question is in the implementation. But again, here, when we have minimum standards, we have deadlines, and we'll have this monitoring mechanism. All the countries have agreed in Action 11 to have a set of indicators to see how BEPS turns out in the future, but how it's been impacted by the measures which have been taken. Digital economy, the same. There will be a monitoring of what's going on, because there is no general trust that things are solved. We're just at the beginning of a lengthy and difficult but very interesting process. Difficult, lengthy, but it shows that tax administrations will cooperate. And that's the new paradigm. We didn't have that prior to the international financial crisis in 2008. We've got good experience on exchange of information. We're now moving on all the corporate income tax issues.
Pascal, I think this follows quite well with what you were just talking about in terms of going forward. There's a number of questions on the follow-up work that you alluded to earlier. So, could you give a little bit of an idea of the timetable for the work going forward, the different types of things that are being done right now and the types of things that are planned for the next few years? And specifically after that, you may want to also talk about, there's questions, the new inclusive framework for bringing all countries in.
Thank you, Larry. The timing question is very important. And it's true that all the participants to that work have focused first on delivering the package rather than on the implementation. So you will see in the explanatory statement that we just have one section on the BEPS implementation with some key principles but no details. So I cannot provide you the details because we are just starting working on the details. That said, we have a few key milestones. As I indicated, first the agreement. I mean, today we're making public what we are reporting to the G20. And we hope that the G20 finance ministers, who have triggered all that work, who have monitored all that work, and I can tell you that they have had long discussions on international taxation over the past 2 years. At all the G20 finance ministers meeting, there was a discussion. So the first milestone is finance ministers on the 8th of October, G20 leaders in November, so that we have an unambiguous support from the G20 and beyond the G20, all the OECD countries and as many developing countries as possible. That's the first step. The second step is about moving to implementation. And we know that many countries have started the implementation on hybrid mismatches, on country-by-country reporting, on many other aspects they have started. On transfer pricing, it's done. I mean, in most of the countries around the world, the authorized interpretation of Article 9 of the existing actual bilateral treaties is the OECD interpretation, and now, because of the G20 countries joining, this will broaden the geographical scope. So it's happening now. As I told you, we've started the implementation on Action 15, on changing the Modal Tax Convention and beyond the Modal Tax Convention, on establishing a multilateral instrument to change the bilateral treaties. And then we'll have to put in place the framework, the inclusive framework, which will monitor, which will have to develop terms of reference, which will have to draw on what has been agreed to put in place a methodology to make sure that we have a proper monitoring for all the G20, all the OECD, all the interested developing countries, all the countries which may not be interested but which should join because they are hubs for treaty shopping or because they would have some harmful tax practices. And this is what we're going to do in the next 3 months. We are going to consult. We're going to consult with the international organizations. In Lima, I'm going to have meetings with the IMF, with the World Bank, also with the UN, with the regional tax organizations like CIAT in Latin America, like ATAF in Africa, to build that inclusive framework together with the developing countries as well, the OECD and the G20 countries. So early next year, we should have in place a framework and then develop terms of reference to put in place the monitoring. And I think we'll have a lot of work to do the assistance, to help our member countries, the G20 member countries, to implement in a consistent manner. And then we'll see how things turn out. And for sure, now we have some form of governance. We do have interests, strong political support for all these, and this will be for sure implemented in the coming months. But there are many challenges ahead, so we'll talk about that rather soon, I suppose.
Thanks very much, Pascal. One of the major accomplishments in the BEPS package that we're putting forward today is the country-by-country reporting. The question here about some of the complaints that we've heard about the information only being made available to tax authorities. Perhaps you might want to explain why that's the case.
You know that the work we do here is bringing governments from many different countries together to agree a common set of principles or of measures. We're not idealist people. I mean, we are, but we have to cope with reality. The reality is that 2 years ago, as regards the country-by-country reporting, we had a number of people campaigning and saying we must have that information. But nothing was happening at all. And what we are coming up with now is a strong agreement which has been negotiated among countries. And this strong agreement is about a very significant, meaningful template of 8 pieces of information which will be described on a country-by-country basis, meaning as many lines, you have 8 columns and as many lines as countries where a company operates. This template will be filed in the country of residence where the multinational is headquartered. And this country will then exchange the information with all its treaty partners. There are conditions to get this information. That's part of the deal. That's part of the negotiation. The conditions are you shouldn't use that to do adjustment. You cannot say, well, you're more profitable here than in my country, and therefore I take the differential as a tax. Not possible. This is a risk assessment tool because it's complex. It provides very useful information, but this is not an assessment. This is not an assessment tool. It's a risk assessment tool. But if a country were not to provide this information because it wouldn't ask for this information, or because from its companies, or because it would decline to exchange these, or because it would not conclude the agreements to exchange these, at some point, the other countries will be able to ask for a local filing. It's true that the countries are around the table and there is consensus. Not a single one said we need to go public. Why? Because they care about tax administrations. And the challenge we faced is rather than going public, and we do understand why a number of people would like this information to be public, and we do understand why a number of people don't want this information to be public. What we know is that the tax administrations said we want this information and we'll do nothing which could jeopardize this information to come to us. And here what you need to understand, because it's more complex than it seems, if you are not backed by the other administrations, the quality of the information you would get may not be as good as you wish. And that's why you have this cooperative game among countries. So moving rogue and say, please give me all the information, it's going to be public, may prove extremely difficult from a constitutional perspective in many countries, and second, may not ensure you to have the most relevant information. That's why this agreement is about tax administrations getting this information from other tax administrations, and what matters primarily from our perspective is to serve the countries, the G20, the OECD, the developing countries which have a very strong interest in this project and in this measure in particular, so that they get the information, they can do the risk assessment, and at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, you will have a behavioral impact. When the tax directors will have to file this, they will have to think twice whether it passes the test of the CEO and whether you can explain that all your profit is in a no-tax jurisdiction where there is no activity.
Thanks very much, Pascal. I'd just like to remind everybody who's watching right now that there is a second webcast coming at 4 o'clock. For those of you who've been watching our webcasts over the last couple of years, you know that that'll be a much more technical discussion. Pascal will be joined by a number of the other senior officials from the Center for Tax Policy Administration, and there'll be a much deeper discussion of some of the technical aspects that some of you have been asking us about in the questions. I just wanted to point that out. 4 o'clock in an hour and a half for those watching wherever you are. A couple more questions, Pascal. One that I think is a reasonable one, and you alluded to it earlier, is the risk of double taxation. Is that going to grow, unfortunately, or perhaps ironically, versus what we're trying to accomplish here?
The answer is yes. Unambiguously, yes, and it has been the case for some time, before the BEPS project. Actually, one of the motivations of this project is to limit the risk of double taxation. That may sound a bit counterintuitive, but it is not. We have seen, for those working in international tax matters, we have seen increased disputes over the past 2 decades. Why? Well, first because you had more and more aggressive planning from companies. And why? Because the international tax rules were no more fit for purposes. And that's why you had this more aggressive planning. But on the other hand, you have a number of countries which have not been OECD countries, which do not adhere necessarily to all the OECD underlying principles, and which have been more active in terms of receiving investment and therefore in terms of doing audits. It's true also for OECD member countries. And what was at risk because of the lack of trust in the reliability and fairness of the international tax system. Fairness meaning, does it reach its goal? Does it make sense anymore? And because of all that, we have seen increased disputes. So we were in the worst of all the worlds, meaning that on the one hand, we had massive base erosion and profit shifting, and on the other hand, we had increased disputes. A number of them ending up in courts with governments losing because the instruments were no more fit for purposes. What we've done was to try to bring all the countries around the table and say, we need to fix the standards. We need to fix the standards to save the standards, to save the ability of all the governments to eliminate double taxation, which is needed to attract investment, and investments are needed for growth and for jobs. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. But you cannot save the instruments if they facilitate double non-taxation, because if governments need to attract investment, they also need to collect the taxes. And they must collect the taxes in accordance with their domestic legislations. Where the domestic legislations are at a failure because of the weaknesses of international cooperation, there is a problem. And this is this problem that we try to solve with this BEPS project and the BEPS implementation, which will start now. Now, we need to recognize that there has been increased uncertainty. And that's why we have come up with a minimum standards on Action 14, which is about mutual agreement procedure, so that if there is double taxation, there will be a mechanism to ensure that it is eliminated. So double non-taxation, but also the elimination of double taxation.
Pascal, you spoke earlier about the multilateral instrument. And we have a question here, actually a few, about the different types of actions that are going to be included in the multilateral instrument. And maybe you would just want to speak a little about that and about who's actually participating, what's happening now, where is it going?
Last year, we came up with a report in accordance with the action plan. It was Action 15 report, which said, we've been asked whether to foster the implementation of tax treaty-related BEPS measures, we could have a multilateral instrument. The answer is, it's complicated. It's never been done, but it's feasible. So we can actually negotiate a multilateral instrument which will implement the tax treaty-related BEPS measures. What we've done since is that we have put in place an ad hoc group, which is a conference, an international conference to negotiate a multilateral instrument. And we've called all the countries and a number of jurisdictions to join that negotiation. Today, we have 90 countries which have joined this negotiation of the multilateral instrument. We had the first meeting, an inaugural meeting in May, and we'll have the second meeting, which will be the first round of negotiation, the first week of November. What is going to be negotiated? Well, the implementation of the tax treaty related measures, BEPS measures. These measures are incorporating into this multilateral instrument the provision about hybrid mismatches, Action 2. We have also provisions, and that's the core of it, Action 6, which is about the end of treaty shopping. But we also will incorporate the new definition of the permanent establishment, Article 5, which is Action 7. When do you start being a taxable entity in one country? What's the threshold? And this is to put an end to the commissioner arrangement and to some exemptions. And finally, we may have some measures related to Article 25, which is about mutual agreement procedure. And for sure, a number of countries have said, it's not part of the minimum standard, but that's a very strong message. A number of countries have said, we are going to do arbitration. In the cases where we have double taxation due to an audit in one country and some adjustments, and that we don't get along well with the other competent authority, we're not able to eliminate double taxation in spite of the minimum standard, which will provide for reporting to the G20 and so. But in case we still don't agree, we agree to go to arbitration. And we'll have to develop provisions to incorporate them in this multilateral instrument. This will be optional. Not all the countries will join. And we fully recognize that a significant number of countries don't want to hear about arbitration. So be it. But those willing to do it will be doing it. And we're confident that there will be a growing number of countries interested in that if we get the balance right. So the negotiation of the multilateral instrument will be about all that, incorporating all these measures. And the goal is to finish the negotiation of this instrument by the end of 2016, which means that we would take slightly more than 1 year to amend all the bilateral treaties. As I told you, almost, I think today it's 90 countries, and it's growing. I mean, we have more and more countries joining. And these countries have agreed that they are negotiating this instrument. They may not sign it at the end of the day. We'll see what the outcome is, but we see a growing interest, and you may have read here and there that this is a very good test and a very good demonstration that international cooperation is on its way.
Great, thanks, Pascal. We have time maybe for a couple of more questions. One that just came in is on country-by-country reporting, obviously one of the bigger items that we've been talking about. We've set here a $750 million threshold. Is that the right level, and how did that come about to be reached, and will it have an impact at that level?
There was some discussion on whether we should cover all the companies or not. And that's also true for the template. How many pieces of information should be included in the template? You had countries starting with, dozens of pieces of information. Some others saying it should be limited. And interestingly, the dividing line was not necessarily about conservative countries and more aggressive countries, but what's the most relevant? I do personally think that 8 pieces of information, that's extremely interesting, because then you have the big picture. And what matters is to have the big picture. Now, the second element for discussion was, do we ask all the companies or not? And the tax administrations were fearful that they would be drowned into the information, that they may not be able to check the relevance of the files that they would receive. And they said, as we start from scratch, let's be reasonable and let's test it. It's pretty complicated because that will be automatic exchange of information. We're already developing the IT to do that. We're not waiting, and we'll piggyback on the work which is being done on the Common Reporting Standard to make sure that we can facilitate the automatic exchange of the tax rulings, but also on the country-by-country reporting information. And that's where we ended up with this threshold. It's arbitrary. Is it the best? I just don't know. But that's a start. And for this start, we have tackled the largest, the 10%, the upper tier of the multinational companies, but this represents 90% of the activity of multinationals. And this will be reviewed and revised by 2020. What we need to have in mind in terms of calendar is that it's expected that the fiscal year 2016 will be reported on the country-by-country reporting, which means that the returns will be returned to the tax administration sometime in 2017, and that's where the automatic exchange of information will start. So we'll have a couple of years of experience in 2020 to check whether the threshold should be revised downwards, which is the expectation, but we'll have to draw on the experiment that will start very soon.
Pascal, I think we have time for one more question here as we wrap up the webcast. And it's a bit of a provocative one, but I think it gives you an opportunity also to reflect on the work that's taken place here in the BEPS project. It's to say, why wasn't there a consideration of moving towards formulary apportionment? Why did you stick to the arm's length principle in transfer pricing? Is this a big bang that we're seeing here today, or what? And I think that's the question that a lot of folks have been asking.
Thanks, Larry. Actually, and thanks for those asking the question. This has been a recurrent question. I alluded to it earlier, some thinking that either you do unitary taxation because multinationals are actually groups, so they are one economic entity, and if you deal with this one economic entity as if it were made of separate legal entities, you fail. And I see the economic merits of this approach. But what you need to know and to understand is that first, when you really think hard of this option, you find as many deficiencies as with the current system, where the deficiencies are obvious because it's been tested. So first, let's be very careful. I mean, it's very easy to say that one system, untested system, is perfect, where actually it is not. Second, not a single country around the table, and that includes the developing countries, has asked for that. Because if you want to move to unitary taxation, I mean, you need to agree on a number of things. First, where will you consolidate the calculation of the profit? Then, what are the criteria to share the profit? Unfortunately, within the European Union, they've been working for 20 years on a common consolidated corporate income tax base, and unfortunately, there has not been much progress, if any. So we can say there is an ideal system that we need to move to, or nothing happens. And we are pragmatic. We say, well, as nobody stands ready to move there, can we fix the system? And the answer is yes, we can fix the system. It's been tested. It doesn't work that well, but it works largely on many cases, and where it doesn't work, we can fix it. How can we fix it? That's all the work on transfer pricing. If you're interested, listen to the webcast at 4 p.m. because they will get into all the details. But basically, you can rely on the contracts between the different legal entities of a group. But if these contracts do not reflect the reality, then the tax administrations will be equipped. They were not. Now they will be equipped with the tools which will allow them to say, sorry, you may look at all the intangible property, all the intellectual property in one cash box in a no-tax jurisdiction where there is nobody. That doesn't work this way because all the research and development, all the teams are in another country. All the functions are exercised in this other country. So we're going back to common sense. And I do think that both methods, arm's length principle on the one hand, unitary taxation on the other hand, at the end of the day are equivalent. But the cost of transaction, the cost of the transition to another brand new system is such that countries, all the countries, have decided not to move into that direction, but rather invest the money to fix the system. We're fixing the system. This is to be tested. We're not naive, and we're going to see whether it works fully or not, and then we'll draw lessons on that. But please, let's not be theological. I mean, this is good for academic work, fantastic. But in the real world, either you fix the system or you say, well, we cannot fix it, so let's move to another system. Maybe this will happen in some time, but there is urgency. We need to collect the tax now. And this is what I think the BEPS project will allow the member countries and the non-member countries to do.
Pascal, thanks very much. I was going to offer you a summing up, but I think you've just done it. And so I'd like to thank everyone online who's been watching, who's been sending in questions, who's been watching the BEPS project as it's been evolving over the last 2.5 years. Please continue watching. All the information is obviously available on the website, oecd.org. You'll find it. The reports, all 13 that have been alluded to, all the 15 items. As has previously been said, please tune in at 4 o'clock for the technical webcast, those of you who are interested. And I thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Pascal. And thanks to all of you.